Hello, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. We welcome you to the second CEM Dialogue. And this one will be on presenting the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. Next, please. So the program today, the agenda today is, we will start with a 15 minutes presentation by Angela Andrade on the introduction and the background on nature-based solution and on the standard. Then the second part will be starting with presenting the scientific background behind the global standard, and then we'll present in detail each of the criteria. So each of the 8 criteria within the standard, and we'll finish with a presentation of the standard self-assessment. And then the last part will be an open discussion where you're welcome to ask questions and to intervene. Next, please. So some housekeeping items. Everybody will be muted by default, not to disturb the presenters. If you have questions to ask, or if you want to enter in the queue for the open discussion, so the last part of this webinar, you can write your question in the chat or in the Q&A section, and please introduce yourself as well. Or you can raise your virtual hand or send CEM a request to get in the queue. And then you will be unmuted when it's your turn to talk. Just for your information, all the documents that are referred to with regards to NBS are accessible in the IUCN or the CEM websites, and this webinar will be recorded. Next, please. So we'll start with the presentation by Angela Andrade, the chair of CEM. Thank you.
Don't really see Angela online anymore. Emmanuel.
Yeah, I'm trying to reach out to her. She had some problems just before.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, here she is. Angela, you're welcome to start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and apologies. It seems that my connection is quite weak. But yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this webinar. This is, as was highlighted by Emmanuel, is the second dialogue of CEM. Next one, please. So I will just want to start highlighting some of the trajectory of the work that on NBS that has been done by IUCN. So the most important moments are referred to 2016, when IUCN members adopted a widely accepted definition on nature-based solutions, together with a set of principles that facilitate its implementation and gave a mandate to work on developing a standardized process. The nature-based solution is concept and framework is framed on the ecosystem approach that was adopted by the CBD at the end of the previous century. and is built upon the knowledge and the experiences obtained from different ecosystem-based approaches, such as ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation, ECO-DRR, ecosystem services, the work that was done on natural solutions. Well, at this point, we are also facing a very important momentum since in 2019, several international organizations and in several international events, the concept of nature-based solutions is being adopted and promoted. And recently we have the IUCN resolution that was also recently adopted by the members, and we will speak about that later. The next one, please. So as I mentioned, well, we all know that we are facing a planetary emergence for climate, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, human health, among others, and sustainable human activities from farming and mining to industry and infrastructure are undermining the productivity of vast areas of farmland, forests, and other ecosystems all over the world. And this degradation is threatening food security, water supplies, and the biodiversity upon which human development depends. It drives and is exacerbated by the climate crisis. So, and we all know that we only have 10 years left to start bending the curve on climate change and halt biodiversity loss before these impacts are affecting our society. So there are some important events that, as I mentioned, the UN Climate Action Summit last year, and that adopted the Climate Manifesto in 2019 on nature-based solutions. We also have an increased recognition of the relevance of nature-based solutions in the global biodiversity framework. We also have all the initiatives that are promoted by the presidency of COP25 and 26, inviting countries to include nature-based solutions in their NDCs. We have also the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We have also the initiatives that are promoted by the World Economic Forum on the Global Future Council on nature-based solutions, recently adopted, and the IUCN Resolution 60 of 2020. Next one, please. So given the increased attention on nature-based solutions, it's important to clarify what they are and what they are not in order to prevent from being misappropriated from any effort that undermines ambitious climate action and the achievement of other global societal challenges. So to be successful, it has to go beyond the conservation community and include other players, such as the private sector, government departments, who do not deal directly with conservation. Nature-based solutions, as we know, is not an excuse for governments or companies to avoid or delay rapid actions on reducing carbon emissions and addressing the problems of biodiversity loss, nor are they a justification for projects that harm local communities or violate indigenous people. And we all know that the term of nature-based solutions could be ambiguous. Many simply associate nature-based solutions with tree planting, for example, which is not the case. In fact, in some instances, such as monoculture plantations, planting the wrong trees in the wrong places can also undermine climate and biodiversity and affect the goals on sustainable development. So this is why we all agreed as IUCN members in 2016 about the importance of developing a standardized process to mainstream nature-based solutions. Next, please. So the global standard on nature-based solutions it's centered on the protection, restoration, and sustainable management of the world terrestrial and marine ecosystems to help increase climate mitigation and adaptation around the globe, as well as support sustainable development, protect areas, and promote biodiversity conservation in an integrated manner. And they are part of a broad multi-sectorial action needed to achieve the main global challenges we are facing today and the ones that are threatening our sustainability. The standard considers that there is no standalone solution and the need to develop hybrid approaches. And we can also understand the nature-based solutions framework as a new proactive paradigm with ecosystem health and sustainable management at the core. The standard consists of 8 criteria and 28 indicators that will be explained today, and that should be applied in an integrated manner. So some of them, as you know, they are focused on the global societal challenges. They guide the design of the solutions responding to the geographical scale, promoting landscape approaches and aiming to build resilient landscapes. It's also about process that enhance biodiversity and promote ecosystem integrity, making sure that nature-based solutions are economically viable. Is also based on inclusive, transparent, and empowering of process for communities. Is addressing the balancing of trade-offs and choices that need to be made to achieve long-term gains, and how to ensure that there is a transparent, equitable, and inclusive process. Criteria 7 refers to the need to respond for adaptive management, which facilitates continuous learning about processes and adapting to NBS according to systemic changes. And finally, criteria 8 is about promoting mainstreaming with national and sectorial policies, which is critical to underpin the long-term sustainability. The next one, please. So the standard includes 3 documents. That the first one refers to the full description of the standard. The second one is about the guidance, that and the third one is about the self-assessment tool for the implementation of the standard. And we will be addressing all these topics today. Next one, please. As the standard, as we all know, has been developed with the full participation of many people from the Secretariat, from the commissions, especially the Commission on Ecosystem Management, with technical contributions from other members. And if you remember, there were some open consultations to participants, members from the different commissions and from IUCN members. We also have specific contributions from groups. And yeah, there were also several people who contributed with the peer review process, and also the final layout and production of the first version of the standard. Next one, please. And so at the end, and this is just to finalize the standard proposed, here is a first party verification, a self-verification approach that aligns with the intent to provide a facilitative standard that supports users to transition towards well-defined and durable nature-based solutions, a robust governance structure and application process with learning feedback loops to improve the standard as needed. And this governance structure recognizes the value of science and traditional local knowledge, the need of learning from experience through a well-established community of practice, together with the International Standard Committee and the regional hubs that will facilitate the process. And the role of the Commission is focused mainly on the Science and Knowledge Committee component. The next one, please. So, and I wanted to also to end highlighting the recent adopted resolution that was voted by members, and this became into is effective since the 21st of October of this year. And I want to highlight the main requests for the Commission, that is focused on identifying specialists with a diversity of skills to provide the scientific advice required for the application of the standard across different national circumstances, and to provide evidence-based inputs to the periodic reviews of the standard, and also compile, manage, and share lessons learned from the application of the standard at local, national, and international level. So as we know, we have to start implementing the standard since it became effective last month. Next one. Yeah, and this will be also a matter of discussion today. And these are some of the research priorities that we identify in a previous meeting. And this will be also a topic in which we are really looking forward to your feedback and your comments. So some of these priorities were highlighted and focused on the need for integration in national and international policy and agreements, the implementation of NBS in a specific context, related to the standard. Most of the topics that were highlighted are related to the monitoring framework, and also finally the relationships between the nature-based solutions standard and ecosystem-related concepts. So with this, I want to finalize and give the floor to Emmanuel to start with these very short presentations regarding each criteria and indicator. And after that, as was mentioned before, we are looking forward to your questions and your feedback to improve the standard in the coming future and find your views on this process. So thank you very much for attending. And Emmanuel, please, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation, Angela. So next, please. Thank you. So I would like to start by presenting the definition and the conceptual work that IUCN and the CEM has collaborated on, and which has served as the basis for that operational framework of NBS, for the global standard on nature-based solutions. And then we'll move on to presenting the different criteria. Next, please. So as Angela mentioned, we had a resolution in 2016 when nature-based solutions was defined by the IUCN community. And according to this resolution, nature-based solutions are actions, so different actions that either through protection, through sustainable management, or through restoration of different types of ecosystems, either modified or natural ecosystems, address global societal challenges while they ensure both benefits for humans and benefits for nature. So it is imperative that nature-based solutions provide benefits both to human well-being and to biodiversity. The main societal challenges that IUCN has targeted in that specific definition was climate change mitigation and adaptation, disaster risk reduction, ensuring that there is socio-economic development, that there is food security and water security. And lately, since that list of societal challenges is not a definitive one, we've added reversing ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. Next, please. In addition to the NBS definition that I've just mentioned, the 2016 resolution has also presented a set of 8 principles to be considered in conjunction with that definition. So I'll just mention a few here. The first principle, for instance, nature-based solutions embrace conservation It is important to understand that NBS is not there to replace nature conservation and conserve specific species or ecosystems for their own sake. But instead, nature-based solutions embraces and complements nature conservation and can, in certain cases, benefit from its effort across a landscape. For instance, if a protected area was established to conserve a certain species, but later that protected area contributes to an NBS intervention that is nearby. The second principle here, for instance, nature-based solutions can be implemented alone or in an integrated manner with other types of solutions like technology, engineering, or the use of media, public awareness, and so on. And for instance, we can mix a mangrove restoration and the construction of a seawall to get coastal resilience against storms and floodings that are coming from the sea. And then, for instance, Principle 8, saying that, referring to the fact that NBS are integral part of the overall design of policies and measures or action to address a specific challenge. So for NBS intervention to have a broad influence, it is important to make sure that they are not only practically undertaken in the field, but that they are incorporated in policy and in related action. And the implementation of this particular principle will support large-scale intervention, which is also mentioned in Principle 6 here, on landscape scale, and will include the potential for adaptive management. Next, please. To better understand the NBS framework and the relationship among the different approaches, we found it useful, first of all, to consider NBS as an umbrella type of concept that covers a whole range of well-established ecosystem-based or ecosystem-related approaches. Can you, next please? And we found it, thank you, and we found it useful also to identify that umbrella type approach that NBS is and categorize it with 5 different categories: protections, issue-specific, infrastructure, management, and restoration. And under each of these categories, we have concepts that are well-based, as Angela's already mentioned, like area-based conservation, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based mitigation, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, ecological restoration, natural infrastructure, and so on, which has very much helped to develop that NBS framework. Next, please. Then to complete that first definition or conceptual work, we further wanted to ensure that NBS can really serve as a good umbrella type concept, and check that there were no gaps, or if there were gaps, identify if there were any gaps in the definition or in the list of principles. So for this, we reviewed a numerous number of approach. Can you please, next please? Thank you. And we selected those five approaches that had published list of principles in order to compare them to the NBS principle. So those 5 approaches are the ecosystem approach, which is the foundation to NBS, ecological restoration, forest landscape restoration, ecosystem-based adaptation, and area-based conservation. Next, please. So what we found out when we compared the principles, the 8 principles of NBS, to the principles in those 5 other approaches, next please, is that there were 3 of them: the one on synergy, the one on landscape scale, and the one on policy integration, which were different from all the other approach, and that NBS, since it was broader, could serve as a good umbrella type concept for the other ones. Next, please. And in addition to that study, as I said, we also identified some gaps in the NBS definition and principles. And that was really important to identify at this stage, at the definitional stage or conceptual stage of NBS, to ensure that they were considered and they were addressed in the development of the NBS global standard. So some of those specific terms that were either missing or not sufficiently emphasized in the principles or in the definition were adaptive management and governance, effectiveness, uncertainty, multi-stakeholder participation, and temporal scale and long-term stability. Next, please. So this slide is just to illustrate the links between, on the left side, you have that first work that we did with the definition and the principles, and how they link to the right side of the slide that represents those 8 criteria that Angela mentioned that compose the global standard on nature-based solutions. So the standard, the global standard consists of 8 criteria, 28 indicators, and it's strongly built on the NBS definition and principles. And also, of course, on the feedback that was received between the 2 public consultations, with more than 800 responses that were received, as well as several meetings, brainstorming, and round of reviews. Next, please. So the purpose of the global standard is to set a common basis of understanding for NBS, and to provide a robust framework with a consistent approach for practitioners to both design, to implement, to assess, and to adapt and improve nature-based solutions. And that will help to contribute to transformational changes by improving NBS interventions to address global societal challenges, and also to support through clarification and development NBS related policy. And then last, the standard is intended to use or to be used by anyone that is working on the verification, design, and scaling up of NBS. So that incorporates, for instance, project managers, landscape planners, development practitioners, conservationists, finance sector representatives, both donors and investors, governments, policymakers, and planners. Thank you. Next. Oh, and here's the last slide, just with some of the references that I've mentioned. So there is, as I said earlier, you can go in the IUCN CEM website or on the IUCN website under the nature-based solution team, and you will find all these publications. So the 2016 publication on nature-based solutions to address global societal challenges, which also provides 10 different case studies of what we consider successful NBS case studies, or what we considered then. Then the paper that we prepared in 2019 that goes further in detail on that analysis of the core principles and the definition of NBS before moving into the development of the standard. And then, of course, those 2 main publications on the global standard for nature-based solutions and the guidance for using the IUCN Global Standard for NBS, which were both launched at the end of July. Next, please. Okay, so we'll now start to go into each of the criteria separately. So as we've mentioned it already, any NBS has to address one or several societal challenges. So that the purpose of this first criterion, criterion 1 on, is to make sure that the NBS is designed to directly and explicitly target and respond either to one or several societal challenges that has or have been identified as a priority by those that are either already affected by the challenges that is targeted, or those that may be affected by the challenge. So the first indicator refers to the need for NBS intervention to respond to at least one specific societal challenge. And all the stakeholders that are involved, especially the right holders and the beneficiary of the NBS, must be involved in the decision-making process that is used to identify those challenges or this challenge, and that's the NBS is targeting. Then the second indicator is referring to the importance that these societal challenges are understood at the relevant national or local context, that drivers and responses to the societal challenges are identified, and that the societal challenges are documented and accessible to the affected stakeholders, or those that are part of this NBS. And the type of baseline that could consist of situation analysis that is informed by scientific or by grain literature, and it could include consultation with relevant stakeholders like the beneficiaries, as I said, and other actors like government agencies, private sector companies, local academics, and scientists that have the expertise on the particular societal challenge that we want to address. And then the third indicator is about ensuring that human well-being outcomes are relevant to the targeted societal challenge, and that they're identified, and that there are benchmarks that are in place in order to monitor their impact, and that there is a plan to assess these outcomes and the benchmarks regularly as part of the NBN design and the planning. Next, please. So some challenges that I thought could be problematic, or that we could encounter was implementing this criterion, would be that opinions on what is the most pressing societal challenge to address may be different from between different stakeholders. So it is really important to have a transparent and an inclusive consultation process that is put in place, and this will be further developed with Criterion 5. Then another point is that it may be difficult and it may be very time-consuming to document and to collect evidence on the targeted societal challenge or challenges, especially if we want to involve all the relevant stakeholders and experts to provide the best expertise on the subject. And then the last point is that will be, I believe it could be important to develop tools to help stakeholders assess how these societal challenges can actually benefit human well-being. And maybe we could support this, or IUCN could be supporting this by developing some trainings on how to assess these. Next, please. So here are just two last points that I would like to make on that first criterion. The major societal challenges, as I said, that were identified so far were climate change, mitigation, adaptation, disaster risk, social and economic development, human health, food security, and water security. And that was in the 2016 definition. But it's important to know that this is not a definitive list, and it has already evolved once during the second consultation process already of the development of this global standard on NBS. We've added that seventh challenge, which is reversing ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. So this is something that may occur in the future again. And then the second point is that it's a bit related to this, but it's important to know that if ecosystem degradation is being addressed as one of those societal challenges, it's important to have at least one other challenge that must be part of the design of the solution. And this is in order to differentiate the NBS intervention from a pure conservation action. and make sure that there are benefits to biodiversity, of course, but also to human well-being. Next, please. Okay, so the second criteria the second criteria is good NBS design should be aware of and needs to take into account the interaction that happen across different social and ecological scales within a landscape or a seascape. And it's important to understand how different ecosystems within the same area or the same landscape are arranged and they interact. And we need to ensure that at each phase of the development and the implementation of the NBS intervention, that larger landscape and seascape are considered. And by that scale, it not only applies to the biophysical or the geographic perspective, but also to the influence of economic systems, policy frameworks, and the importance of cultural perspective. And this will be touched by, presented in other criteria. So the first indicator here is it aims at actively encourage synergies and complementarities with other between NBS and other sectors and between NBS and other types of interventions like engineering, information technology, financial instruments, and so on. So going beyond, we're really open and we're really encouraging this type of synergies and complementarities to be done. In the second indicator, NBS design seeks to maintain the productive capacity of ecosystems, as well as the production of benefits necessary for human well-being. Sorry. Can you go to the next one, please? Okay. Back, please. Sorry. Yes, and then the last one. Sorry, the last one is it is important for the design of the NBS to incorporate both risk identification and risk management beyond the intervention site, and ensure that, for instance, or gather some information and ensure in the planning of the NBS that the drivers of internal and external risk have been identified, for instance, that scientific and local knowledge concerning these risks has also been taken into account, that the design of the NBS is taking into account external risk and internal risk. And making sure that the risk management plan is revisited throughout the intervention time scale. And this can be, and we encourage this to be a part of the planning. Next one, please. So with regards to some challenges that I could think of, and I will be very happy to hear if some people have already tested the global standard, how if they have other challenges to list. But it's important to ensure that other sectors won't be using NBS for other purposes, and ensure that the NBS is the intervention that is seeking for complementarity and not the other way around, of course. And with regards to working with different sectors, it may be challenging to reaching out and to collaborate with other types of stakeholders that are not used to being part of such processes. So it's important to ensure a clear and common objective. Next one. And my slide here is just to illustrate that type of complementarity. So here we have a watershed with forest and with mangroves, and on the left side we have a protected area. We have wetlands in the middle. Next, please. And then due to different societal challenge, climate change, disaster risk, there are floods, and there is a loss of food, there are flooding problems, and it affects, of course, human health. Next, please. So in this case, hypothetical scenario, there is here, we can see a complementarity that was done between different types of NBS. So there is mangrove restoration along the coastline. There is forest landscape restoration around the that watershed. There is wetland restoration. There is also the complementarity with the building a concrete wall to avoid flooding. And there is green infrastructure maybe in the city that is nearby. And also we can see here the illustration of the complementarity with the protected area that serves here on the left side, as I said, as to ensure that forest landscape restoration and the restoration of the overall area is strengthened and is helpful. Next, please. Okay, so Kara, you can go on with the presentation of Criterion 3.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emmanuel. This is Kara Nelson with CEM's Ecosystem Restoration Thematic Group, and I have the pleasure of introducing the third criterion, which states that NBS result in a net gain to biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. This means that regardless of which societal challenge is going to be addressed, NBS actions must safeguard both of these elements, biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, which is, of course, is critical as loss of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity adversely affects the functioning of an ecosystem as well as its ability to provide goods and services over the long term. So NBS have to avoid undermining the integrity of the system and instead proactively enhance functionality and connectivity. There's 4 indicators for Criterion 3, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. Next slide. The first indicator is that NBS actions must directly respond to the effects of ecosystem degradation and its drivers. So to achieve this, NBS must include a detailed baseline assessment that characterizes the current ecological condition of the system and also drivers of degradation and options for net improvements. Next slide. The second indicator is that clear and measurable biodiversity conservation outcomes are identified, benchmarked, and periodically assessed. This indicator requires that every NBS develop specific and also measurable targets for enhancing biodiversity. For a target to be measurable, it has to include more than just a general attribute. It has to include specific variables, and specific variables should have units so it's clear exactly what's being measured. The target should also include the action desired, for instance, increase, decrease, maintain, the quantity desired. Is it a 40% increase, a 20% increase, and the time frame? Next slide, third indicator. Monitoring includes periodic assessments of unintended adverse consequences. Management activities are always experimental, and there's a level of uncertainty in how ecosystems are going to respond. NBS should, of course, be designed to minimize unanticipated risks, but it's imperative that NBS include monitoring of both effectiveness at achieving targets as well as non-target effects that could potentially compromise the ecosystem. Next slide. Okay, great, thank you. The fourth and last indicator, opportunities to enhance ecosystem integrity and connectivity are identified and incorporated into the NBS. The NBS approach requires explicitly considering opportunities to enhance biodiversity conservation. For instance, if NBS activities are implemented close to core areas for conservation, then they should leverage opportunities to maximize biodiversity outcomes by enhancing landscape connectivity. This means looking outside of your direct project goals to leverage these opportunities. Okay, next slide. Safeguarding biodiversity and ecosystem integrity is essential within the NBS framework, but doing so is really challenging. I'm going to just mention two challenges, in my view, both of which require transformative approaches. First, identifying a broad set of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity variables. Conventionally or historically, management interventions tend to focus on just a limited number of narrowly defined goals, like reducing wildfire hazard that's threatening homes, removing invasive species that reduce forage area for livestock. The problem is that taking a narrow approach ignores the underlying structure of socio-ecological systems. So care must be taken to select variables that represent all aspects of the system: composition, structure, function, external subsidies, and more at both, ecosystem and landscape levels. And then briefly, a second challenge, including biodiversity and ecosystem considerations through the program or project life cycle. So biodiversity values, they have to be included at project inception and design, and monitoring must begin prior to treatment implementation. The challenge is that it's often included as an afterthought when treatments have already been implemented and it's too late to get that critical baseline information or to implement meaningful monitoring programs. Next slide. I want to end by highlighting the importance of management interventions keeping pace with scientific understanding about ecosystem integrity and complexity. And this is really an example from river restoration. An NBS intended to improve river ecosystems can't just consider a river as a pipe of water, but must recognize the interconnectedness of the system in order to support biodiversity. So this is including longitudinal connectivity from the source of the river to its mouth, which I think most people do think about. Also lateral connectivity across the floodplain, but even more than that, vertical connectivity, meaning the fact that water from the river moves down through the hyporeic zone underneath the river and out across the floodplain and back to the river through a complicated sequence of upwellings and downwellings. And it's actually this vertical movement of water that's critical for keeping the river cool in summer and warm in winter. And it also provides habitat across the floodplain, carrying water to wetlands, swales, and all the mosaic habitats, out across that floodplain. So interestingly, in ephemeral pools in these floodplains, the water from the river is keeping those pools, the bottom of them, at less than 7 degrees Celsius in the summer, while the top is 25 degrees. So this is just a small example of the complexity and the integrity that's needed to support biodiversity, and NBS Criterion 3 is about safeguarding and restoring those elements of the system. And that's it for me.
Hi, Emmanuel. Hi, others. Let me join here and begin discussion on the economic criteria, Criterion 4 on economic viability. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is why do we need to consider economic viability of NBS? And we do need that because one of the common challenges facing nature-based solutions is the lack of economic justification, financial planning, and long-term resources to support them. There are NBS interventions that may heavily invest early on without considering the economic and financial viability beyond the time frame of the intervention. Now, this is a problem because it not only increases the risk of the NBS failing, but it also does not take full opportunity of what NBS offers towards sustainable development. In fact, economic viability and feasibility is critical for NBS to be sustainable economically, in addition to the other key pillars of sustainable development, environmental and social. Now, to address these concerns, the purpose of the Criterion 4 is to ensure broadly economic viability of NBS. The Criterion has 4 indicators. At the please go back. Yeah, thank you. Let's stay on this slide. Thanks. At the very basic level, indicator 4.1 simply requires that all the types of benefits provided are documented, including who receives them, what the costs of provision are, and who bears those costs. Now, the benefits and costs can be assessed in non-economic terms or economic terms, or both. It's important to give consideration for market and non-market aspects of NBS. By doing so, we ensure a comprehensive assessment of all the benefits and all the costs, identifying who is the payer and who will benefit. The next 2 indicators, 4.2 and 4.3, are linked in that they both address cost effectiveness. What is cost effectiveness? Cost effectiveness denotes the cost at which NBS can achieve specific societal objectives. It could be CO2 mitigation, it could be coastal protection, water purification, or any other NBS objective. For example, we might be measuring what is the cost in monetary terms of mitigating 1 ton of CO2 emissions through NBS, or what is the cost of reducing expected property damage due to coastal flooding. Here, it's important to note that cost effectiveness does not require monetization of benefits. Rather, non-monetary benefit endpoints can be incorporated by using their physical quantities. For example, benefits can be measured in, again, CO2 tons mitigated, tons of soil erosion prevented, cubic meters of drinking water purified, and so forth. Indicator 4.2 simply requires that a cost effectiveness of NBS is assessed. So it doesn't go beyond that, just evaluating the cost of addressing one specific challenge through NBS. Analytical framework can be a cost effectiveness study. There are other ways of addressing this, including cost benefit assessment or even multi-criteria analysis. Now, indicator 4.3 goes one step further by requiring not only that the cost effectiveness of NBS is evaluated, but that is also evaluated and justified against other possible solutions. And these other possible solutions could involve other NBS, but typically the other solutions would involve more conventional approaches. They could be purely technological or engineered solutions. They could be structural solutions, oftentimes referred to as gray solutions. Again, for instance, for climate mitigation, the alternatives could involve reducing emissions from other sectors of economy beyond nature, considering reducing emissions from energy sector or transportation. For coastal protection, other alternatives could involve building seawalls or breakwaves. Water purification would typically consider technological solutions, water treatment options. In any case, it's important that other alternatives are identified, evaluated and justified against NBS. Finally, indicator 4.4 requires that NBS design and implementation considers resourcing. What are the resourcing options that are available to support NBS? Here, we could consider market-based resourcing options, but it could be oftentimes public sector. It could be voluntary commitments and actions to support even regulatory compliance. Oftentimes, it may be a mix of resourcing options that is best in supporting NBS. The key objective here is to ensure adequate resourcing of NBS in both near term when the implementation takes place, but perhaps especially in the long term. Only this way NBS and its long-term sustainability can be sustained. It's also important to consider a range of options. And here the task is made easier as the number of resourcing options is actually increasing as demand grows for NBS. This perhaps concerns especially innovative financing options such as blended financing. Regardless, the most important element here is that a long-term business and financial plan is developed and it needs to look beyond the initial implementation and planning and implementation stages. Now, taken together, addressing these four indicators helps ensure that NBS are economically viable. There are, of course, different levels of fulfillment regarding different indicators and the degree of scientific thoroughness in assessing them. But regardless, evaluating and strengthening the economic viability of NBS does play a key role in the long-term viability of NBS. Next slide, please. There are a number of challenges in assessing these indicators as any other indicators. I'll just briefly note that first of all, there's work that needs to be done on the development of a comprehensive accounting framework that would actually consider the multifunctionality and the multiple benefits of NBS. There are a number of conceptual and empirical complexities in assessing benefits and costs. There's the issue that oftentimes NBS provides benefits in the long term, whereas the costs of NBS are incurred both in the near term and long term. So here the issue is, how do we actually weigh in intertemporal benefits and costs? What sort of discounting do we use? What's the distributional consideration between current and future generations? And then finally, when we think about implementation, it's critical that the NBS considers moving beyond conventional markets, because conventional markets will almost surely underdeliver on the multifunctionality. So there's a need to develop innovative policy instruments to consider the comprehensive range of benefits that NBS can produce. There's experience on payment for ecosystem service programs, blended finance, and much more. But much more is needed in this context. So there are a lot of challenges and a lot of research needs, but at the same time, what I would like to point out is that there's a sufficient knowledge on all aspects of NBS along these four different indicators discussed here. There's knowledge there to get started on all of them and even do a good job. So the challenges and research needs established here should not be seen as insurmountable barriers. Next, please. Here, simply a listing of a few key pieces of literature that can help you learn more about the criterion and especially the economic aspects of evaluating NBS. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Lia Dwasa, who is also a member of the steering committee of the Commission on Ecosystem Management. I'm going to talk about Criterion 5, which is that NBS are based on inclusive, transparent, and empowering governance processes. And this is probably where we'll probably see a lot of challenges as well. There are 5 indicators. The first one looks at fully agreed and developed feedback and grievance resolution mechanisms that are available to all stakeholders. And this is important because there will be compromises probably to do between different groups that exist in the same large landscape. And there's a need to really have conflict resolution mechanisms that can help deal with issues of conflicts, issues of challenges between the different stakeholders, because everybody will have different interests in the same large landscape. The second looks at participation that is based on mutual respect and equality, regardless of gender, age, or social status. And I suggest that we probably should have also cultures, and upholds the right of Indigenous people to free, prior, and informed consent. And this is in respects of UNDRIP and other type of legislation that exists in several countries. And this is very important because there have been so many what we think are solutions that are in fact are impacting a lot, especially Indigenous people. The third indicator is a stakeholder who are directly and indirectly, and this is very important, affected by NBS, are identified and involved in all processes of the intervention. This means that we have to first have a good idea of who are the stakeholders, who are the people who are directly and indirectly. And indirectly may be a question of consequences in the long term. So it's not just a question of right now, we have to find a solution, but the long-term impact that it can have on other people. So this is more complex, and it requires really for anybody doing such intervention to really understand what is there. The fourth indicators looks at decision-making processes that are documented and respond to the rights and interests of all participating and affected stakeholders. So it goes back again to the importance of transparent, inclusive governance that really talks about the full ecosystem, not just a few interested parties, which will require this compromise and understanding the views of everybody. The fifth indicators relates to where the scale of NBS extends beyond jurisdiction boundaries. And we have to remember that landscape ecosystem are not closed system. So they will have impact on other systems. And we have to understand that, because what can happen, and I like the Kara's pictures about the stream. It's not only the stream, it's all the full ecosystem around. There are connections everywhere. So we have to understand these connections. And this means that we have to have mechanisms to be able to look at joint decision-making that can help with these kind of different jurisdictions that may be impacted by the NBS that are getting prepared. Next slide. Next slide. Oh yeah, thanks. So in terms of main challenges and research needs to implement Criterion 5, I should say there are many, and I have to stop at one point. But in terms of challenges, we have to remember one thing, is that we're talking about people working together. And when we try to do that, in many cases, it can be challenging. So there are several challenges that may come. The first one is when we have an external organization that are trying to promote an NBS and they have funding. The challenge, and in fact, it may be a trap in some cases, is that they bring the fund, they think they know everything. It's a little bit like any development organization that go to a developing country and that they think that they have the solution. And we'll have to be very careful. And again, it relates to the fact that we need to have an inclusive governance. And that means that it's not just a top-down approach. It has to be a bottom-up, and it brings all the local stakeholders first. The other challenge that we'll have is that in many cases, funding is only for short-term projects. And we have to remember that in many cases, NBS will be for long-term solutions. And this means that you have the need for long-term stakeholder engagement, which will include, for example, social learning. And this is not something that can be done on a short-term basis. So this is quite complex. But however, if we want inclusive, transparent, and empowering governance, this is essential, and that will require more time. The problem also, and the challenge will be that many governments will want to have results very fast. And again, that means that they sometimes will short circuit the stakeholders, the local stakeholders, and that may cause a lot of issues, conflicts at the end. A lack of understanding of and respects of Indigenous knowledge and people will be also another challenge in many cases. It's easy to implement without having to deal with the on-drip. And this again will cause a lot of issues. And we need to make sure Canada has had its share of problems and doesn't necessarily understand all the time what it means prior, free, and informed consent. So that's something that will need to be resolved. Focus on only one location, not thinking about possible impact on other location is another issue. And that means that there's a need of several types of research in terms of first developing principles for ecosystem governance. And this is something that our thematic group is working on right now. A better definition mechanism for real needs versus wishes of stakeholder. And this is something that can be quite dangerous, because the wishes may probably not be feasible. And we have to define what are the needs really. How to ensure real, transparent, free, prior informed consent, and how. And the how is very important. That means that we have to understand cultures. We have to understand what are the cultural practices that are coming. Finally, co-developing the objective and co-construction of solution and co-implementation. There are research on that, but there's a lot more needed to better understand how to do it, especially to reduce the possibility of conflicts, and also see how compromises can be done. Finally, how to measure governance capacity. Not all landscape and communities have the same capacity. And in some cases, there may be even conflict. So that's not helping. And I've seen that, especially when I was working in Africa. Next slide, please. So there are many good papers on governance. Very few, however, are going from theory to practice. This is the interesting part. We have published at the Commission a paper previously on ecosystem governance. And there are a couple of other papers. One thing that is very clear is we're not necessarily doing very well in terms of understanding this issue of open, transparent governance, where we tend to believe that it's easier to just go for a top-down approach. So meeting the bottom up is very, very difficult. So there's a lot more to be done. One little case study that I find quite interesting is Cliff Sound UNESCO Biosphere Region in Canada, in British Columbia, where in terms of, it's not an NBS, but in terms of ecosystem governance, has been doing very well. And this is between the First Nations and the non-Indigenous people in trying to protect the salmon. And this is just a little point that they put in terms of everything is one. Embodies sacredness and respects of the salmon. And this is really showing that it is possible. And in this case, they advanced quite a lot in terms of knowing how to deal with ecosystem governance. So that it is for criterion number 5.
Great. Well, this is Pam McAwee from the Cultural Practices and Ecosystem Management Thematic Group, and I'm going to be speaking about Criterion 6 today. And really the key concept behind Criterion 6 is the idea that any sort of intervention that we do is going to potentially have trade-offs. And so we need to acknowledge those and find ways to manage them. So Criterion 6 really builds off particularly Criterion 3 and Criterion 5 that we just heard about, thinking about ways in which we make sure that our interventions are ecologically sustainable, that they respect governance institutions, and that they basically try to achieve equitability. So the criterion is really that an NBS should equitably balance trade-offs when they're trying to achieve their primary goals and the provision of multiple benefits. So there's 3 indicators of interest here. The first one is that costs and benefits of these associated trade-offs are explicitly acknowledged. And so explicitly recognizing the potential trade-offs that are going to happen will help us make informed decisions with regard to safeguards and any sort of corrective actions we need to take should negative consequences occur. So criteria 2 relates to the fact that usage and rights and access to land and resources vary among different stakeholders. And so we need to acknowledge those. We also need to acknowledge the fact that different stakeholders are likely to have different responsibilities. So all of that is part of this forward-thinking acknowledgement, trying to anticipate any sort of potential problems and trade-offs. The third indicator is that we use established safeguards in NBS, and that those safeguards are then periodically reviewed so that any sort of trade-off limits that are agreed to are respected over the long term. And all of these indicators are aimed at trying to anticipate any problems that might arise so that they don't destabilize the entire intervention. So to sum up criteria 6, it's really about assessing and managing trade-offs that might occur both in social and ecological outcomes. So next slide, please. So what are some of the main challenges that we're going to face when we're implementing Criterion 6? Well, the first one obviously relates to how do we assess the potential costs and benefits of trade-offs? How do we understand these among affected stakeholders, and how do we revisit these periodically? And this is going to require fair and transparent processes and potentially consequences like compensation for losses. If, for example, people lose access rights to certain areas of land because these have been reforested or restored in a certain way, that might trigger an interest in compensation. So these need to be recognized and planned for in advance. The second potential challenge is going to relate to the rights, the use, the responsibilities of stakeholder groups, and how do we analyze them and assess them? And this is going to require methods that are systematic and appropriate tools. So this can, depending on the NBS intervention, range from stakeholder analysis and mapping to free, prior, and conformed consent when we're talking about Indigenous communities, just like Criterion 5 recommended. The third challenge is going to be what safeguards we put in place and how do we periodically review these to anticipate and avoid those negative consequences. So safeguards are going to have to be in place systematically. And again, these may vary by the NBS intervention, but there needs to be something in place. And that something in the form of safeguards needs to recognize that inequities that may occur may change over time. And these will need to be assessed periodically, and that not all stakeholders are going to be equally affected. So we need to make sure that everybody's interests are recognized. Next slide, please. So the final questions in this slide relate to scientific and knowledge gaps. Where do we need to do more research, and where do we need to potentially do learning by doing? So as NBS are implemented, where do we need to be focusing our efforts to learn from experience? And I would say there's 3 areas that really jump out for this criterion. The first one is to make sure that our environmental and social safeguards are appropriate to the NBS. And this is going to be a great example of learning by doing. So as NBS use different types of safeguards, whether these are legal grievance mechanisms, consultations, right of appeal, and so forth, we need to know what's working. And we need to ask ourselves, can we use existing safeguard policies? For example, the standards that the climate community and biodiversity standards embody, or do we need to create new ones? The second area is that trade-offs are inevitable. We just have to accept them. But there's going to be disagreements about conflicting values and priorities. And this is a very complicated process. It gets into cultural valuation and all sorts of other issues. So we need to learn from best practices here. And finally, we need to balance the fact that trade-offs are going to occur in both the short and long term. So we need patience, we need systematic processes to try to understand these potential trade-offs. And these long-term and systematic processes may not be compatible with short-term project cycles. So we need to recognize that and be aware of it. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Radhika. I work for the IUCN Secretariat as the director of our Global Ecosystem Management Program, working closely with Angela and many of our colleagues in the webinar today and having worked closely on the standard development. So I'm going to talk about criteria 7 and 8. And sorry, you can flick through already. So as we go through this, you may be thinking, but this is nothing new. These are elements that we perhaps use anyway as best practices or good practices in implementation. And to some extent that's true, but it's putting all of this together as the 8 criteria is what gives us a benchmarking for what we want, what our aspiration for nature-based solutions is. And that's certainly the case with Criterion 7 and 8. As I go through them, you'll see. So Criterion 7, very straightforward in its intent. Adaptive management, all nature-based solutions are managed adaptively, importantly based on evidence, so that any decision-making, any changes is based on evidence. And this translates, and next slide please, into 3 indicators. One is an NBS strategy is established and used as a basis for regular monitoring and evaluation of the intervention for any changes you may want to make, any unanticipated issues, etc. Second, and that includes your theory of change. There's a lot of assumption. Like we assume that, if we manipulate nature in this way, this is the outcome we're going to get. But in between, so many different things could change. You're working with dynamic systems here. So how do you make sure that there's something to go back to and be used as a basis for regular monitoring, evaluating, and rethinking and redoing our intervention so it stays relevant and robust? 7.2, a monitoring and evaluation plan is developed and implemented throughout the intervention life cycle. And then again, closely related to 7.1 in being able to anticipate, monitor, and respond to things as you go along in the process of implementation. And third, a framework for iterative learning that enables this adaptive management approach is applied throughout the intervention life cycle. So it sounds very straightforward, but of course this depends, some of the challenges, this depends a lot on the availability of data. What is that baseline and the strategy that we're going to use? Sometimes it's difficult to establish this in that very rapid moment. We need to get going with our design and implementation. What we're trying to do is look at retroactively applying the standards to projects and work we've done in the past to be able to show ideas and good practices from the past that come close to demonstrating this point of having a strategy, seeing it through, being adaptive, etc. And this retroactive application hopefully helps generate evidence much faster, because people are asking, so what does this look like? Do you have any examples? The second thing is, what's a good periodic time? Is it 1 year in a project management cycle? If we're shifting out of project management cycles to that bigger picture transformative change, what does that look like? Like periodic management and making sure that's followed through in, let's say, for 10, 20, 30 years of whatever the timeline is that you're working through. So it's a shift in going from, fairly small scale pilots, 3-5 years, to a big picture intervention that you want to maintain as a relevant and robust intervention in decades to come. And then third, I think the promoting the learning culture itself. There's a lot of work for us to do there in being able to internalize and leverage our own lessons learned instead of doing it for the sake of it. And this is a part of that learning by doing, and then doing by learning iterative culture that we still need to build on. And that's certainly a challenge for all of us coming from our different expertise and areas of work, and putting those pieces together, but then being able to learn together and move this forward together. So just next slide, please. Just quickly to give you an example that is already in the standard document. To demonstrate, we're not saying that this case study from Shinyanga, Tanzania is actually nature-based solutions, but just to demonstrate that, some of these good practices we've been practicing in conservation projects for a long time. Right. So this is, you can click, I think there is a text box in the next, yep. So this is a project from 1985, looking at restoration of an area in Tanzania, which was known as the desert area of Tanzania. And the whole initiative called Hashi, which is known as Shinyanga, basically, because of the place in Tanzania. They started a mass restoration effort, but really looking at planting exotic trees was a very top-down approach developed and pushed by the government. And it started showing the typical cracks of, lack of ownership, lack of engagement by the communities. So there was a rethinking of this to start looking at traditional institutions of land management and how they were respected and incorporated into driving this process, rethinking and redesigning the whole effort from, who's going to do what to what kind of species could be planted for mutual benefit. And this project managed to do a very solid turnaround. By 2004, over 300,000 hectares were restored. Nearly every family had restored more than half of their degraded lands. And this hashi practice itself is now adopted within the policies and approaches for land degradation, reversing land degradation in Tanzania. And the concept itself still lives on as something that can be replicated. So very quickly, this project was able to take on measures which ensured that there was a shift and there was engagement, and that this still today stays relevant in many parts of Tanzania in how they do restoration of their degraded lands. Okay, Criterion 8. I think it's next. This one, for those of us who worked together, was quite an interesting one to debate. I suppose we can call it the ambitious criterion, which is about looking at scaling up over time. So again, shifting from time-bound projects to actually doing nature-based solution as the new business as usual. How do you make that happen? So how do you make sure NBS is sustained and mainstreamed within appropriate jurisdictional context, whether it's embedded institutionally, whether it's looking at policy alignment, etc. And what does that take to have NBS live on over the time scales, going well beyond, let's say, my career or the practitioner who's driving this, and making sure that there is sustainability and it lives on. So next slide, please. So that translates into 3 indicators. If you could click again, yeah. So NBS design, implementation, and lessons learned are shared for triggering that big picture transformative change that we're trying to drive, where it's not about conservation safeguarding as such, but it's being able to build on all of that, IUCN 72 years of conservation knowledge and practice, and go beyond to make conservation actions socioeconomic development strategies. How do we develop to improve quality of life using nature rather than seeing it as a hindrance, as a red tape? So NBS design, implementation, lessons learned are shared for triggering that big picture change. NBS inform and enhance policies and regulatory frameworks to support the uptake and mainstreaming. I'll get a bit into the challenge of it, and where relevant, and we do our best to make sure NBS are aligned to national and global targets, whether it's for human well-being, climate change, biodiversity, human rights, etc., taking into account things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Now, some of the challenges we're seeing and we had anticipated is, this can't be an exercise to validate your solution because XYZ country has signed up is a signatory to a certain contract, whether it's biodiversity, etc. It's not validation, but it's looking at systematically using those projects or initiatives and feeding it into the country's contribution, being able to show that, that's one of the mechanisms through which the country is meeting its target. So there's a whole thinking around, so how does this plug into that bigger national commitment or the national priorities of a country, especially for actors who don't necessarily work with governments directly, unlike IUCN, where in most countries we work directly with governments and their policies. And one of these actors is companies, the private sector. So what is the equivalent for companies in terms of being able to show a policy change or a regulatory framework, rethinking and shifting it? That's still a piece of work we're working on with the World Economic Forum and some other WBCSD, some other private sector networks that we work with. What does this look like for a company operating in a country, and what then can be shown as evidence or sources of verification to meet this? And then the third one is seeking sectoral alignment. You know, often this is something that everyone talks about, but quite difficult to achieve. The idea of one solution being beneficial to multiple problems, whether it's water, food, climate risk management. So how do you get that level of alignment where it's feeding into different resourcing and reporting mechanisms, and making sure that in trying to solve one problem right now, we're not creating another problem because we haven't thought about this sectoral alignment, because we typically function in our siloed ways. And then the next slide, please. Just as an example, you can click through. So just as an example, in this case, El Salvador, looking at using the forest landscape restoration to meet multiple SDG commitments, making sure, you know, there's opportunity for scaling up. So El Salvador has pledged to restore 1 million hectares by 2030. And right now they have 277 restoration projects using FLR. And just to align these, they've had to look at almost 13 different policies and acts across the different ministries to see how this can be done by making sure that all the small pieces of the puzzle are feeding into this bigger picture change they're trying to drive, and making sure there's capturing of the benefits, direct and indirect, which is job creation, emission reduction, reducing degradation, etc. So a big piece of work there in actually embedding El Salvador's bond challenge as part of its multi-sectoral mechanism to meet its national commitments to sustainable development. So I think that is my last slide, and that is the last criterion. And it's over to you, Daisy.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm Daisy Hessenberger, working with Radhika Murthy here in IUCN headquarters as a young professional. If I can share my screen or we click through to my slides. Great, thank you. So I think it's actually perfect timing also for us to talk to you today, as we're following on from hearing from our colleagues. And part of a lot of my role, besides assisting with the development of the standard and the rollout and the launch, is actually to put the standard to use. So I've been part of a various amount of piloting processes on current interventions, past interventions, even policies. And so just to say, you know, why use the self-assessment? If we take a step back from, you know, why use the standard, why use the self-assessment? So the three sort of reasons that we came up with on why you would use the self-assessment sheet that we've created for the standard is to assess whether an intervention or proposal adheres to the standard. And that's very specific wording there. We're measuring adherence to the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. You can also use the self-assessment sheet to inform internal and external stakeholders on the means of verification in place, or lack of those means, to measure the indicators and identify areas for improvement. So when we took the standard and we put together a metrics group with CEM, these were the ideas of, okay, well, you need to create a tool which allows this as a first step. And we decided to keep it as a draft and during the piloting process. So as all of you know, this is what the standard looks like. We've told you about the user-friendly booklet on the left, and we've talked about the scientific guidance booklet, sort of lengthy tome on the right that gives you the scientific foundation. I'm here to present the draft self-assessment sheet. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the backbone of the standard, which is these 8 criterion that you've now been introduced to. But how do you measure your adherence to these 8 criterion? Well, each of these 8 criterion have those indicators. And with working with the metrics group, we came up with a very simple scale: strong, adequate, partial, or insufficient, with plenty of discussion on why those words. And I'm happy to go into the numbers. You get of how much you get assigned, how many points you get assigned for different measures. But what I want you to remember from this slide is that when doing a self-assessment, when using the standard, you rate how well you address the indicators. So strong, adequate, partial, and insufficient is how well have I addressed this indicator on cost effectiveness, for example. That will then be fed up into the outcome sheet where you get a normalized number showing your adherence with the criterion. So you're not measuring that, it sort of feeds into that automatically, and you'll see that in a second. So what this looks like in practice, we all know Criterion 3 now, NBS result in net gain to biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. We'll look at indicator 3.1, directly responding to evidence-based assessment. So looking at the baseline, understanding the state of your ecosystem and the drivers of degradation and loss. You can go into the guidance booklet and also the scientific guidance document to find out a bit more about what this means. And now it's up to you, the user, how well does my proposal, policy, intervention match to this indicator? Is it strong, adequate, partial, or insufficient? Now, above is what was published. That's what's sort of, the concrete skeleton or backbone of the standard. Below is still what's in flux in response to what we're learning from the pilots. So we've added with the metrics group just some, and these are not another level of indicators. These are more just helping users to define the difference between adequate and partial, or partial and insufficient. And actually, we've added some guiding questions to this as well, because that's the feedback we got from the pilots was we can't tell what's the difference between adequate and partial. So we've added in this level in the draft self-assessment tool. So let's say you're looking at an intervention, let's say forest landscape restoration. You've gone through all of your indicators and you've rated them as well as you can. You've given some rationale, a means of verification. And now you're going to go to the output screen. This is where you will see the overall output of your intervention. So for each of the criterion, you'll see your final percentage match. And that is based on how many of your indicators you have, insufficiently or partially or strongly addressed. This is all normalized. So in the first iteration of the self-assessment tool and the first iteration of the standard, because as mentioned in the governance structure, the standard will be revised every 4 years, sorry. Currently, all 8 criteria are equally weighted. What that means is that we've just normalized the score of the percentage of indicators that you've met. And that gets you your overall output, where orange is partial, red is insufficient, light green is adequate, and it's into quartiles. So 0 to 25%, 26 to 50%, 51, and so on. And the main thing to take from here is that to be in adherence with the IUCN Global Standard for nature-based solutions, you have to at least have partially addressed every single criterion. So what that means is if you are strong and green on 7 of the criterion, except for biodiversity net gain, where you're insufficient, you are not in adherence with the IUCN Global Standard, and we have pilot examples of that. What that also means, however, because the aim of the standard is to raise the bar of practice, if you have a partial on every single one of the 8 criteria, you would currently be in adherence with the IUCN Global Standard. Now, this is also the point where I should say this is currently a self-assessment. So just a self-assessment with the credibility added by you adding in the means of verification. And really one of the first questions to ask when using the standard is, why am I doing this self-assessment? Because it will inform what you do with the results. Would you now use this to improve your intervention? We have examples of ones that match as well. And I'm checking the time. I'm on 6 minutes. So I think I'm just going to show a couple of steps. So this is the 6 sort of steps that we've shown on how to use the self-assessment sheet. There's an instructions tab, where you can list also the resources you might need. And then in each tab on the sheet, you can use the guiding questions to rate your intervention. You can change the rating in the sheet, fill in a short rationale, and list your means of verification. You then go to the overview tab where you'll see that screen that I just showed you, identify gaps. And we do recommend that users also then consult to finalize the assessments and identify recommendations. So get together a small working group. And again, this is not necessary, but we recommend that to end, users report the results and the lessons learned. And that's either by email or there is a survey available, which is linked in the sheet. Now, because I have 3 minutes left on my 10 minutes, I am going to take the opportunity to open up the self-assessment sheet just to give you a quick test. So if someone can say, yes, I see that, I'll zoom in a little bit. So
now
here,
we can see it. Thank you.
great. So here you have the instructions tab. It's basically the 6 steps that I've run through. Please note, this isn't yet that user-friendly. We are working on improving this in every iteration. Eventually, it will hopefully be an online tool. But for now, after instructions, you can go to resources, list some of the documents you'll need. And here, then you can start going to your criteria and saying how well you match each one. Let's just change these. You go adequate. There's a little arrow just on the right bottom there. Let's say strong. And you will see if you go to overview, that will automatically update there and down here. Now, to get the latest self-assessment sheet, what you need is to join the user group because it's a draft format, and then it'll be the latest one will be emailed to you so that you don't start using an older sheet. I'm going to stop sharing here and just speak to you from Switzerland, because I was asked in my final couple of minutes to expand on what we've started learning from the pilot. So we're putting together, a report and understanding of the lessons learned from the pilots. We'll be talking again to the metrics group about that. But what we're seeing is that varied uses of the self-assessment tool. So different stakeholder groups need it for different reasons. And so for that, the guidance or the user guide will really have to reflect the different ratings or uses of the self-assessment tool is one thing that we're learning. Another thing is that extra step. So there is still a request of a link to tools or how do I address this indicator, something that is still also being worked on, a tools compendium. And there's a few other lessons learned, but those will have to be reported back later as we sort of put that meta-analysis together. And that's it from me.
Thanks very much, Daisy. So I think we're done with all the first 2 parts of this webinar. Manuela, could you please share the last slide of the presentation? And we'll start with the discussion. The last part of this webinar. So there are a lot of questions that have been asked, and I've made a list. I hope that we'll go through most of them. So the first one is regarding the link between NBS and the pandemics. And I would like to ask Angela to please answer.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very important topic. And as you can see from our graph, one of the 7 societal challenges that we have is human health. And for that, to address that one, we have the approach that is being proposed by the World Health Organization, adopted by the CBD. And so I think that there are many areas in which we can connect with that one. The human health is a main challenge. Is very much connected with the topic of ecosystem health that has been indicated and presented, especially in criteria 3. And yeah, for us and for CEM, it's becoming one very important topic. For those of you who don't know, we established a new thematic group early this year on human health and ecosystem management. And the group has been very active and working together with other groups under the leadership of Carlos, who is the leader of that group. Other groups like ecosystem restoration with Cara, Liet on ecosystem governance, the group of rewilding, and others. We are working on some specific activities related to that. So the answer is that is connected with many SDGs, but it's specifically included in the whole standard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Angela. So So next, I would like to ask Pam to please answer the question regarding also the link between nature-based solutions and indigenous and knowledge and local knowledge and indigenous people and local communities, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your question. Indigenous people and local communities are mentioned explicitly in Criterion 5 and 6, particularly when we talk about the need for free, prior, and informed consent, both as a safeguard, but also as a governance tool. But beyond that, basically each of the criterion can potentially benefit from use of Indigenous and local knowledge and ensure that Indigenous and local people are included as stakeholders and rights holders when we're talking about things such as addressing societal challenges, making sure that there's economic viability, balancing trade-offs. So it's really important to note that while several of the criteria are explicit about IPLCs, all of the criteria can potentially include attention to them, or should include attention to them, and can make use of Indigenous and local knowledge. And let me just say specifically, for example, to give a concrete example of this, so Criterion 7 is about the need to manage adaptively. And we actually have a lot of experience from IPLCs using Indigenous and local knowledge as a way to manage adaptively, because ILK is based on oftentimes very long time series of observations and understandings. And so it's by its very nature has been able to adapt to environmental change over time. So that's a great example of where the criterion could really make use of ILK and integrate it into the ways that the NBS moves forward. So again, these are going to be very context specific. The different interventions may involve different types of ILK, but for sure it can be woven in to across all the criterion and all the approaches potentially.
Thanks so much, Pam. Then next, there was one question regarding capacity building. So I was thinking maybe Radhika could answer it with regards to capacity building that is provided within the overall governance structure of the standard.
I actually responded in writing.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
That's all right. I can quickly share. So we are putting material together right now and testing it out internally. We did a series of trainings across our 10 regional and sub-regional offices, the last one being today and tomorrow, just to test it out with IUCN colleagues as to, you know, the relevance and the contents. But the idea is to then hopefully secure some resources to roll this out at scale next year amongst all of IUCN members, and anybody externally who is interested in having the capacity build on nature-based solutions, because this is absolutely the next big step. If we want people to use this standard and be able to work with us on NBS, then there is this issue of building those capacities for people to be able to do it. And then how it's built into the NBS NBS governance structure is, you would have seen from one of the slides Angela presented, there is a national and regional hubs that will be created, obviously first leveraging IUCN's 55 offices, the presence we have around the world, and also looking at working with our members in the different countries and building their capacities. So these become the hubs, the technical hubs to go to for users and new users or people interested in knowing more about nature-based solutions. So there's a lot to be done there, and things are in process, but hopefully early next year we start rolling out a large-scale capacity development initiative that everybody can benefit from. Thanks, Emmanuel.
So much, Radhika. Okay, next I would like to ask Chua to answer the question regarding the user-friendly that Mike Jones answered, please.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Thanks, Mike, for that question. So user-friendly guidelines for practitioners. I think the short answer is that I'm not aware of a user-friendly guidelines or package that would directly address nature-based solutions, but there are a number of efforts that have been underway that are moving towards more and more user-friendly packages and guidelines for valuation. I shared a few links in the Q&A function, but perhaps to get started, the INVEST effort by Stanford, TNC, WWF, and others, and specifically the tool INVEST is a set of is basically a platform to develop valuation approaches for ecosystem services at the local level. I think it's a great start. Then there's the effort called the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. TEEP that provides quite a bit of material in this context. Some of that kind of slightly outdated now, but can still be very helpful. And then the third effort I'd like to point out is this current revision of the ecosystem accounting framework, the international standard developed for national accounting. There's a good bit of material that is coming from the revision that will be released in 2021 that has been developed with the purpose of informing practitioners, statistical offices, but also other practitioners. So there's quite a bit of material potentially available, but it might actually be a good idea to think of whether there's an effort needed to develop a valuation guideline specifically for NBS. So I think that would be something to keep in mind moving forward. If not a specific guideline, then I think at least providing links and synthesis of the currently available guidelines and platforms. I think that's something that probably would be good to provide. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joe. So now there is one question about cultural change also coming from Mike that Kara and then Liat wanted to answer, please. So Kara first and then Liat. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll just read the question. Mike asks, following on from Radhika's mention of the need to create a culture of learning, what other aspects of cultural change does the panel think might be important for effective MBS implementation? I 100% agree with Radhika's comments on the culture of learning. And Mike, thanks for asking this question. I'll just offer two perspectives on cultural change within the scientific community and management culture. And so first, I think we really need to see a cultural change in terms of the extent to which scientists innovate new knowledge into practice. And this came up just with your previous question, Mike, as well. So within the culture of science right now, new knowledge goes out into just scientific products, articles in the peer-reviewed literature, and we need to do a better job of expecting that scientists will engage in moving that new knowledge into cookbook prescriptions that can be used on the landscape. And then with respect to culture for managers, the change there, what would be really transformative is to engage in real systems thinking. There's good evidence that reductionist approaches are more likely to have unintended consequences than to achieve desired effects. And then finally, acknowledging uncertainty. What's interesting, at least in the United States, and I'm based in the Western US, is that we do less environmental review for activities that aim to improve ecosystems than we do for extractive activities. And so I think we need to revise this culture and recognize that it's hard to improve or do actions that are going to benefit ecosystems and biodiversity, and to build in appropriate review and monitoring. And I'll stop there and turn it over to Liat.
Yes, I agree with you on these points that for the science as well as for the system thinking. And I think there's also a culture, change in culture cultural change that will be needed for many funding organizations, because they tend to really look only at the mechanics, if we want, the engineering part or the solution itself, without looking at communities, especially indigenous communities. And this caused a lot of problems, and especially in terms of social acceptance, but gradually also maintaining these solutions. Because one thing that I always say when I work with the community is that by the end, I'm not living there. So I will not deal with the consequences. They will deal with the consequences. So this is why it's so important for them to be part of it. So it's part of the system thinking that we have to make sure everything is connected there, because if not, it's not going to work. And this is why I have the feeling that many people think that NBS will be easy by just fixing things. But by the end, I think this is the biggest challenge, is not thinking correctly about the long term. How can our one ecosystem is connected to another one? All these kind of things. So that's the main challenge. That will be a humble learning, I would say, to deal with that, and especially for funding agencies.
Okay, thanks very much, Cara and Lietz. So since we need to wrap up, I'll just have 2 more questions answered by Daisy that were specifically on the metrics, please. There was one coming from Fabrice, and then another one. Thank you, Daisy.
Yes, I answered them in writing, and you can see them in the answered section of question and answer. But just to reiterate that you can access the self-assessment tool. Of course, we can share it directly, but the way to access it and to share that access is to go to this survey where you can enter your details, and that just makes sure you get the latest self-assessment tool. And if it's updated, that you keep getting the latest self-assessment tool if you're using the standard. There was a question that I can go a bit more into, which is that besides timing, because to be honest, we don't have a date for the final self-assessment, it's more likely that it will turn into an online platform, and that the guidance in the self-assessment might still adapt a little bit. But Tamar asked, for self-assessment, most of the time it tends to become biased, especially for government organizations, which might want to show that they're doing well. How can we avoid this, or standardize supervised assessment? And I don't have enough time to go too much in depth, but basically we worked with, when you're looking at a standard and assessments, you look at different levels of credibility. So self-assessment is the lowest level of credibility, and it's also the lowest cost. And we really felt in this iteration that it was important not to create barriers to people using the standard, but rather to facilitate people using it to raise the bar, to improve their interventions. Of course, there's also second-party certification and third-party certification, which are things you're more used to, like the green list, for example, is third-party accreditation, sorry. And so we knew, we did think about the risk of people misusing the self-assessment, which is why it's currently still also in draft form. And really, to raise the credibility of your self-assessment, you can do things like making it visible and accessible, making the means of verification visible and accessible, and also partnering with IUCN. We can't do a formal audit. That would be second-party accreditation, but we can build the credibility and comment on and alter or suggest alterations to the self-assessment, which we have done in some cases for pilots. Saying that, this is for a certain group of stakeholders who are very well-meaning and they're looking to improve their intervention. We are looking at a process of certification, which is being explored, where some users could use this in this manner and other people could use it for a second-party or third-party certification. So with that, I think that's everything I can say in this time.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Daisy, and thank you to everyone who has presented and answered those questions. There were also a lot of questions, sorry, I didn't see them, that were answered by several of you written. So thank you very much. So I'd like to give the final floor to Angela to wrap up the session and to answer also 2 questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Yes, I've seen 2 questions that are specifically related to the COPs, the COP15 on the CBD and the COP26 UNFCCC. So I would say that I think we still need to work quite a lot to make sure that the MBS approach, let's say, is included in the global biodiversity framework. So far, and in the previous drafts, the concept of MBS is just mentioned, specifically related to water management and wetlands, I think. But there are many countries, many organizations that are pushing for having a better role for MBS as one of the main instruments to implement the main challenges of the post-2020 agenda. So, of course, it would be very useful if the CBD is already introducing those concepts. I think is very important. And we still have some months, the SBSTA SBI negotiations and discussions, and we will be, of course, trying to push and to have MBS in a better place in the new framework. And same with the Climate Change Convention. We have been involved in many discussions related to natural climate solutions that could be a subset of nature-based solutions more oriented towards climate mitigation and adaptation. There are several areas in which IUCN has been working on climate change adaptation, such as the FIBA group, Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation, and the Commission has been very much involved also with the group of EcoDRR. Fabrice is around. And so I think that also through the FIBA group, we have been discussing and promoting the use of the standard as a way to mainstream ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation in an integrated manner. A big concern is that in some cases, people is trying to look at the mitigation component as something fragmented, separated, and too much focus on carbon sinks and carbon sequestration. But I think that the full standard is providing an integrated approach and framework to address all these challenges. So I think that what is interesting, and I highlighted that, is that last year, at the end of last year, and also in COP25, we had the opportunity to present some preliminary work on the standard and the concept of nature-based solutions. And I think there were more than 70 events on nature-based solutions at the COP. So I think it's extremely important, and I'm sure that the MBS will have a good place in the future. And regarding I just wanted to close, and perhaps if Manuela can very quickly use the slide where we presented the new resolution, IUCN resolution, because I think that, we have to close, but I just wanted to say that in this series of events, CEM Dialogues, for sure, there will be many more events in the coming year to discuss the standard and how CEM can really work on the mandate that is given by this new resolution. Manuela, no, I think it's the last one of my presentation, because this resolution was adopted, previous one, yeah, this one, thank you. This was, as I mentioned, adopted at the end of October this year. So we have to start working on this. I mentioned that CEM will play a key role in the Science and Knowledge Committee, and we have to work on that. So this is a big challenge for the Commission right now. We are working, discussing. I presented a very quick summary of the priority areas for research, but we have to work on these specific topics, number 2, that are the requests for CEM. And we have to explore ways and ways to work with other commissions, with members, with the Secretariat, in order to guarantee this quality and the evidence that we need to really make sure that the standard is implemented in the right way. So we will be inviting you for sure in the next year to attend different dialogues on this topic. But meanwhile, this is open for you for comments, for suggestions that we can either Emmanuel or myself get this feedback from you that will help us to really work together and build this community of practice for MBS that is really urgent. It's extremely important. We don't want to have just a new concept around. We really need to transform the current situation and make sure that this approach is really one of the best ways to address these big challenges. So thank you very much to all of you for your participation, to all the panelists, and hope to see you soon again with another CEM Dialogue. Thank you very much.